Welcome to the debate. The motion is this House would abandon nuclear power. So why are we having this debate? This debate is important given that energy production and supply is a very current geopolitical issue, particularly as we know that fossil fuels will run out, and this debate centres on whether nuclear or renewable or what combination energy will combine to meet the world's energy needs. So this debate will follow the World Schools Debating Championship format, and it emphasises rigour and real engagement with the other teams' points. It's a good alternative for essay writing, particularly with A-level classes. So this debate will be structured with 8-minute speeches by each speaker, with 1 minute protected time at the beginning and end of each speech, where no points of information will be allowed. We'll return to a speaker for a reply speech of 4 minutes, which is all in protected time. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the first speaker for the proposition.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today on the proposition, we are wanting to abandon nuclear power plants. We are going to act as a global organisation to ensure that all countries around the globe decommission their nuclear power stations. We will not be banning them immediately. We understand it takes time. And when we are talking about nuclear power, we are talking about nuclear fission, so the splitting of a radioactive atom to produce energy. This is what is currently going on in the nuclear power stations today. We are not talking about nuclear fusion, which is what goes on in the sun, where you are combining radioactive atoms to produce energy. We are not against the continued research into nuclear fusion. We just want to ensure that it is done in controlled and safe conditions. And now to the model. We are asking countries to not produce any new nuclear power stations. We are asking them to reduce their use and slowly dismantle them over time. We understand that this will take many years, especially in places like France, where they do have a heavy use of nuclear power stations. We are going to ask assistance from the International Atomic Energy Agency, so the IAEA. They're going to oversee it and ensure that it is done. No, thank you. It is done safely, and they're going to assist with the costs. There are many replacements to nuclear power. No, thank you. Such as hydroelectricity, solar power, and wind power. The points we're going to make this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, are: nuclear power plants are unsafe. Nuclear waste is damaging to the environment. And my colleague is going to tell you how nuclear power plants come at the cost of not being able to improve on renewable sources. My first point today, ladies and gentlemen, is that power plants are unsafe. There are always going to be risks and consequences associated with nuclear power, and we have recently seen in 2011 the Fukushima disaster, where there was a huge radioactive leak. So what problems are associated with the nuclear meltdown? Well, first of all, there is the immediate explosion, which can kill people in the power plant immediately. Yes.
Isn't the very occasional accident a price worth paying for, like, a constant source of clean, renewable energy?
Actually, on the proposition, we don't think any life is worth losing over helping the environment. Every human life is important to us. So the immediate explosion can cause deaths immediately, and there will also be long-term effects on the environment. We have seen in the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, there were huge medical abnormalities going on in the people immediately surrounding Chernobyl. No, thank you. In Ukraine, for instance, they had a 12% adult medical abnormality rate, which is a lot higher than any other Western country. And there is also the problem of straight after the nuclear meltdown. So, no, thank you. People have to go and enter the nuclear power plant to try and stop the reaction. And in the Fukushima disaster, even though they wore hazard suits, no, thank you. They showed very significant increases in the radiation in their body, and this would have immediate and long-term effects on them. And we don't think it's fair on the people that have to go into these power plants to try and stop the meltdown.
Point of information.
Yes.
How likely do you think these accidents will be?
Although on the proposition, we do admit that these are rare, however, they are still going on. And considering there are, I think, 465 nuclear power stations at the moment, there have been numerous plants over the past few years that have had problems. And actually, it's not as rare as people think it is, as people believe it to be. So why are meltdowns such a problem? Well, the nuclear fission is a chain reaction, and often these can be uncontrolled. We saw in the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, people were doing tests which ended up not being controlled properly, and that's when... No, thank you. That's when the problem started. And these problems are still continuing today. There have been, as I said, the Fukushima disaster, and these will always continue with nuclear power plants. No, thank you. My second point today, ladies and gentlemen, is that nuclear waste is environmentally harmful. So plutonium is a byproduct in the nuclear fission reaction, and although it can be used again in other reactions, it is still continually being put in landfill deep underground. And this is a huge problem we feel on the proposition, because often these containers... No, thank you. Often these containers are not sealed correctly. Often companies cut corners, and especially in less economically developed countries... No, thank you. LEDCs. Corners can be cut, and radioactive waste can leak into the surrounding water table. No, thank you. And so not only will the animals be affected by the radioactive leak, but also the humans will be affected.
Point of information.
No, thank you. And even in a more economically developed country, so an MEDC, in America, for instance, they've recently had two radioactive... no, thank you. Two radioactive leaks. The first one was in Carlsbad, where there was above ground air contamination, and workers there showed to have respiratory problems for the rest of their life, they believe. No, thank you. And also in New Mexico, where they were using cat litter. No, thank you. They were using cat litter to try and help the problem associated with nuclear waste. There was a leak caused by the cat litter, and even in places where they have high safety precautions, they're still shown to be radioactive leaks, which can cause such harmful problems to humans. And on the proposition, we understand that nuclear power plants are generally safe. However, there are always going to be risks associated with them. On the proposition, we feel that the problems associated with a nuclear meltdown are so huge, and we don't feel that it is right that people can lose their lives so easily just so we can have a cheap source of energy. So we ask you to propose this motion.
I'd like to thank first proposition for that speech. Now we'll go on to first opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, it wouldn't make sense to wastefully and recklessly step out of the nuclear age at a time when it brings such benefits to humankind. On the opposition today, we stand for the sensible implementation and building of nuclear plants across the world, in line with the recommendations of the International Atomic Energy Authority. We think such an organisation is capable, ladies and gentlemen, of maintaining quality standards to ensure that any accidents are minimalised without decommissioning every single plant and wiping back years of progress that has been good in general for society. Today, we're going to tell you how it'd be a massive waste to decommission these plants, how it'd be bad for the environment overall, and how actually what this does is it actually complements rather than outcompetes renewable energy sources. I'm going to focus on the first two of those points and my partner on the third. Before I move on to my two substantives, ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk about some rebuttal in the response to the material that we get from opening prop. So the first thing they tell us is that there's a massive danger associated with using nuclear energy. We tell you that actually these accidents that happen are rare. They don't happen particularly often. And we tell you that actually these kind of accidents, in the same way that we still fly on planes, despite the fact that there are occasional accidents in planes, we should still continue to use this energy, because such accidents are exceptionally rare. Furthermore, in the events where these accidents happen, it's also incredibly unlikely to result in the loss of life. We point to the example of the United States of America, where in the last 20 nuclear accidents, none of them resulted in the loss of human life. We see that actually accidents that happen with regards to the nuclear power, they very rarely happen, and when they do, they very rarely result in the loss of life. And it's right that we continue to use them and work on trying to improve the safety of them rather than scrapping them over altogether, because that's ultimately the same as trying to scrap air travel because occasionally a plane crashes. It just doesn't make any sense. So it's rare and it doesn't happen. We also see that actually it constantly improving the nuclear power sector is constantly evolving itself to minimise any threats. If any mistakes do happen, right, what happens is they're improved and they're looked over to ensure they don't happen again. It can only get safer with time, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't make to scrap it at a time when they're safer than ever. So the second thing they tell us is that nuclear waste is damaging. We said actually there are precautions in place to ensure that nuclear waste, the damage caused by it, is minimalised. For example, they're buried miles below the ground, they're sealed in concrete containers, and they're made sure they're disposed in places that are safe. We tell you if this organisation that they keep talking about is capable of disposing of every single nuclear power plant, it's probably likely that they're capable also of ensuring that safety standards are also maintained. And it makes actually a lot more sense on our side of the house to continue to make sure that this remains as safe as possible, rather than doing the quite dangerous and arduous task of removing every single power plant. That to us just doesn't seem viable. So on to my substantive. We think that actually by scrapping this, it would be a massive waste to everyone. We see that nuclear power is something that applies to all different countries, from the less economically developed countries to the more economically developed countries. With the less economically developed countries like India and Tunisia, they're building foundations of a thriving economy on the nuclear sector. And it's a viable source of energy, because unlike things like coal and oil, they're not going to run out and they're going to be continued to be used, and they don't damage the environment. They're able to build a sustainable economy in this sector on those areas. In the same way that countries like France, a more economically developed country, bases 75% of its energy output on the nuclear sector. It just doesn't make sense to waste all this time and money by scrapping it on the basis that occasionally an accident happens. The thing about nuclear power is it has a high initial capital outlay, so it costs a lot of money to make. But actually to maintain it, it doesn't cost very much money at all. So you actually need to spend quite a long time before you make that money back. What they're proposing today would strip millions of companies that have set up these nuclear power plants of their money. And what does this lead to? It leads to them trying to find an alternative source of energy that can make them money even more quickly. The only alternative source of energy other than nuclear power plants that's viable and actually produces reliable energy is fossil fuels. We see that actually this will lead to an increase in fossil fuels, not a decrease. And this is backed up by evidence, right? For example, between the years 2007 and 2013 within the UK, as nuclear power decreased, coal increased, because it's the only viable source. Why is this? Because ultimately the renewable sector has not yet fully developed, and the energy it produces isn't plentiful and it isn't reliable. So we see that ultimately what they're producing removes the only viable and clean alternative to this kind of energy. So that's a bad thing, because that leads to an increase. So on to my next point about the impacts this will have on the environment. There are two causes of environmental damage, ladies and gentlemen, that we would categorise. First of all, local damage, and secondly, global warming. We see with local damage, you get damages to one or more ecosystems that have minimal effects on the animals and people around them. Yes, the effects aren't pleasant, but ultimately it has little impact on the rest of the world as a whole. The second is global warming. Global warming happens, and the change happens gradually. The effect is more obvious. Like, for example, in the last year, we've seen an average global increase in the temperature by 1 degree, but the chances are that'll have an effect that really damages a lot of people's lives due to rising sea levels. We see that it's local damage that's sustained occasionally by the use of nuclear energy, and it's global warming that happens as a result of the use of fossil fuels. And we say it's actually a lot more damaging, global warming, because it affects more people, because the effects are more gradual, and because the effects are more severe. We ultimately think that any sector that produces something that will have less of an impact is the more viable one, and in this case, it's nuclear energy. So we see that ultimately the effects nuclear energy will have are limited, and therefore it's right we continue in this way. and ultimately what they're proposing is not a viable alternative. So what does this mean? Well, since global warming is more damaging than local damage, and since nuclear activity slows down global warming because it actively helps this thriving sector rather than preventing to quell it, in return for possible damage occasionally to local, which is rare and less significant when it actually happens, we think ultimately nuclear power is more sufficient and more viable, and it's a viable and the only viable alternative to fossil fuels, and should not be abandoned as a result of this. So ladies and gentlemen, because we think ultimately it would be a massive waste of time and money to do this, and because it would be bad for the environment, not good for the environment, we beg you to oppose the motion.
Okay, thank you, first opposition, for that speech. So to continue the case for the proposition, I call on the second proposition speaker.
The abandonment of nuclear power from the world as a whole would lead to a better future for the human race and also a better future for the environment. At the beginning of my speech today, I'm going to talk about the mistakes that the opening opposition speaker made when he spoke about nuclear power. So firstly, he stated that it was a waste of money to remove these nuclear power plants. But as my partner said, we would do this slowly so that they could get some benefit out of the nuclear power plants that they still have, but while removing them and having the greater good for the future. Additionally, in the long run, and I'm sure the opposition will agree, the best source of energy for the world as a whole is renewable energy. So in the long run, with the removal of nuclear power, we would actually save the money. Finally, we see that doing the right thing for the world as a whole and for the environment comes at a cost of money, which we see that most countries should be more than willing to pay. Additionally, on the point of the reduction of greenhouse gases, the opposition has seen this debate as a point of the lesser of two evils. We say that we should not use nuclear power or coal. We say that we should switch to renewable energy and put more emphasis on the development of it so that we can rely on it in all parts of the world equally, in a more sustainable fashion. Why? Because simply it has absolutely no tax on the environment around it. It uses the things that are already there and that humans have been ignoring for centuries, and using things that damage the world in local and global ways, such as global warming. Additionally, on the idea of nuclear accidents, the opening opposition brought up the idea that the US have had, I believe it was 30 nuclear incidents, and there have been no major accidents. However, the US is an MEDC. It is more economically developed. It's got better safety precautions as it can afford to. In areas which are newly industrialising and in ones that are lesser developed, it's harder to get those safety precautions with a limited budget. No, thank you. And although in an ideal world, every nuclear power plant in the world will be completely safe, it isn't. Steps take slowly over time to develop, and eventually then we would have a safe nuclear...
Sir.
No, thank you. A way of using nuclear power. However, for the cost of lives that come between that time and for the damage to the environment, we do oppose. Additionally, on the idea of dealing with waste, we do say that this encourages landfill culture. No, thank you. As the majority of nuclear waste is stored underground, even though it may be surrounded by masses of concrete, this does still encourage the idea that we can simply remove a problem by burying it underground. This has negative implications on recycling as a whole. Now on to my main point for you today. Now my point is about how investment in nuclear power comes at a price to the development of renewable energy. Yes.
If it's only less economically developed countries that are at risk of a nuclear disaster, why are you proposing a global ban that includes the more economically developed countries that you said aren't at risk?
Thank you. Well, firstly, we see that these things do happen in more economically developed countries, such as Japan with Fukushima, and I was simply taking your example that you had, which is why we should keep it as a whole, even though there are dangers in other parts of the world that you seem to have ignored. Now on to my main point today. So firstly, we see that there should be more money going to renewable energy, as currently there are large amounts being invested in nuclear power, as it is seen as the best viable solution in comparison to coal. But we don't see that we should be balancing these two things. We should say that renewable energy transcends these two ideals and is better than both combined. We think that 100% renewable is the future for the planet, and the sooner we get to it, the better we will be as a global society. So firstly, we see that there are developments towards a fully renewable Earth. Firstly, in New England, there has been the development of one of the largest renewable energy power stations on the entire planet. And this renewable energy isn't just being used in more economically developed countries. Newly industrializing countries such as China have developed the Three Gorges Dam, which is a massive hydroelectric power station.
Point of information.
No, thank you. In India, the Sombar Lake solar farm is currently being developed for the price of around $4 billion.
Point of information.
No, thank you. These are positive movements from not necessarily the richest countries in the world to develop renewable energy as a whole, which can benefit everybody on the planet. So we also say that we admit fully that renewable energy is far away from cost efficiency. This is a natural thing that we have to take on board as it is newly developing. Unfortunately, not enough of the world uses it to be thought of as this viable source that's the opening opposition spoke about. With more development and more investment as something like this that can benefit the planet as a whole deserves, we see that it can become what it needs to be. Yes.
You've just told us about how renewable energy is being improved upon in MEDCs and LEDCs. Is this not sufficient evidence that there is currently development going on in renewable energy?
But as I just stated, there is still a large place to go before it's fully cost efficient, which is what the world needs. Though there are movements being made by countries like China and India, the world over needs to wake up and smell the roses and realise that in the future, the only thing that we can lead at Earth which is fully sustainable is renewable energy, as even nuclear itself will run out with more and more pressure on it from more and more countries. And then the thing that the world has been relying on will cease to exist, which will then lead to massive energy shortages in the period where they then start to develop renewable energy more, which is at the point where they could have done it now. So why do we see that the investment of nuclear power is so important? So firstly, what we see is that any good investing needs public support. It needs people to see that renewable energy is the way forward as opposed to nuclear energy. If the public think that nuclear energy is going to last forever, then they're simply wrong. It will not last forever, and the only thing that can is renewable energy. And I apologise for the reiteration, but it is one of the strongest points in this debate. Simply, the way that the world works is that science has to go further and further, and by simply sticking with what we have, which is fission, even if we slowly develop the health and safety standards of it, we're going to reach a point where we have to stop, and that is going to leave the rest of the world in a place of almost purgatory where they can't change anything. So this development of nuclear power can come at the cost of renewable energy. If countries can afford nuclear power, then they can also afford to develop renewable energy. However, countries like France, as they're now beginning to run over the majority of their country's power by nuclear energy, can seem to forget about this. These are big countries that are fully powerful economically and can help push the rest of the world forward, which they can forget about when they're caught up in this sort of idea. So on this, lastly, to talk about the idea of rebuild, which is what needs to happen. There needs to be a refiguration of what the world looks for in energy. Though we agree with the opposition that we should no longer be using fossil fuels, we also disagree with the use of nuclear power. So what have I told you today? I've told you today why simply a lot of the ideas about nuclear accidents and additionally wasting money don't really stand in a case of the opposition. Additionally, why scrapping nuclear power and making renewable energy is something that's used the world over is the most important thing for the planet as a whole. Thank you.
I'd now like to welcome the second speaker for the opposition.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to be telling you why actually we believe that nuclear power can work alongside renewables and how it can complement it. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to hopefully try and take down some of the assertions being made by government today. So I'm going to start out with some rebuttal. So firstly, we heard from the second speaker about this idea that nuclear distracts from true renewables, whereas what we actually heard from him was a list of renewable developments that are being made, despite the fact that there is nuclear power that is going on today. So we heard quite a contradictory idea from him, the idea that there can't be development in renewables while nuclear exists, and then a list of how renewables are in fact advancing. I'm going to tell you why
they can work alongside each other, which is going to be later in my speech. And we also had this weird idea that funding for nuclear power and renewables are sort of an either-or situation. We don't think this is the case at all. We think that there are two different types of people who'd invest in the different powers. And what we actually heard from my colleague here is actually this fantasy idea that if you stop the fantasy idea presented to us by proposition that if you stop nuclear, suddenly we're going to get renewables isn't true. And this is what we heard from my partner about how, in fact, when you stop nuclear, you get more usage of coal. And this is something we have seen within Britain itself. Yes.
But more funding would go towards renewable energy if the whole concept of nuclear was scrapped.
I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that actually what governments themselves will be doing is looking for, if you completely ban it, what governments will be doing is trying to get the easy, quick fix and the cheapest fix, which is not doing research into how to make renewable energy viable. It's actually just using more fossil fuels. So what we've heard from the second speaker today is clearly not true. Developments are clearly occurring. So I'm just going to reiterate what we've heard from my colleague, and one of the ideas we heard from the first speaker is we heard this idea that governments should be paying for the decommission of these nuclear power plants, whereas in fact actually it's not really governments who'll be taking the hit, it's everyday people who'll be taking the hit, because as we see, decommissioning them is not as easy and as fantasical as we have heard from the proposition. It actually costs in 2007 around £73 billion to decommission a nuclear power plant, and it's estimated that this cost continues rising. Our governments cannot afford to pay this, particularly in this time of economical turmoil. And we also had this idea that the IAEA would be helping to fund it, whereas we think this is quite a weird concept. You as the IAEA are paying to essentially lose your own jobs, because once the nuclear power plants are gone, you don't have a job anymore and you're paying for this to occur. We don't think this is realistic. We actually see that. No, thank you. We actually see that nuclear power is a very good economical idea because you're not having to pay for the decommission. It actually reduces energy bills, which I'm going to go and talk on later. We also had this idea that local damage is still bad and we should still be worried about it, whereas we think it's completely incomparable to what global warming does. And we've had this idea that things are in landfill underground, whereas they're not. We know that there is a system worked out. We've been working with this stuff for 50 years, and there is a system in place. And the IAEA already exists and already implements fines whenever breaches are made. So this idea of the safety concern is also something that's come up a lot, whereas we believe that actually just because it's a possibility does not mean it's a real issue. It won't happen if we have well-built, well-maintained power plants, and we feel that it's actually just fear-mongering by the proposition today. So on to my substantive, the idea about how actually it complements renewables. So why do we care about renewables? We care about renewables because they won't run out and because we don't want to destroy the planet. We agree with the proposition on this. However, we also believe that nuclear power basically meets these fundamental ideas. So the waste produced, it doesn't produce any greenhouse gases. The waste produced is at best harmless and at worst very local damage. There are no greenhouse gases emitted, and actually it's not detrimental to the entire planet as a whole. We also believe that nuclear power plants use so little, both in relation to the energy made and in the amount of uranium present on the Earth, that it's viable for a very, very long time. And in fact, we feel that this makes it almost renewable. And also what we see in places like France, in places like La Hague, and England in Sellafield, is that you use reprocessing, which is a form of recycling with this nuclear energy. And in fact, 17% of France's energy comes from this recycled idea of nuclear power. So why would we then, so if we consider nuclear power to be a renewable, why would we use it in the place of real renewables, as it were? So firstly, we see that these ideas of renewables aren't plausible in a lot of places. Some places can't use solar energy. Some places don't have the dams and the infrastructure and the rivers in order to have that, and we feel that it's very expensive and incredibly implausible to try and transport this energy to these isolated areas, and we feel that actually it's much more plausible just to build a nuclear power station nearer to them. And we feel that renewables cannot cope with the slack that is suddenly going to be in place if you remove all these things. Slovakia, for example, relies on 54.7% of its energy comes from nuclear power stations, and if they suddenly don't have that, I know you said you're going to implement it slowly, but nevertheless, suddenly you don't have that source, and you're either going to have to turn to coal because renewables aren't viable. And we also see that nuclear power is actually the most cost effective, which is what I was referring to earlier. So what we see is that with renewable sources, it's about £95 per kilowatt hour, I believe, rather than £100. It's £95 for nuclear rather than the 100 with renewable energy. So actually we see it's more cost effective, and who you're actually at the detriment of is those with low income. Yes.
Don't you think that people would be willing to pay a bit more if it meant that they didn't have any health problems and family members are less likely to die?
What we see actually is if you are in an economically deprived state, you don't have the choice. You need to be able to have this option of cheaper energy, and we feel that it's better if this cheaper energy is coming from something that's not producing greenhouse gases than if it's coming from, say, coal, which is also relatively quite cheap. So what we see today is that you're affecting the economically deprived most in all countries, not just in less economically developed countries. Therefore, so what I've told you today is that nuclear power still conforms to the ideal of renewable energy, and about how because of the fact that it produces no waste that is actually harmful, because we do know how to deal with it, because nuclear power plants are actually use up so little stuff that actually it's very viable for a very long time, and about how they actually do recycle their waste and in reprocessing. We think that all of these means that nuclear still conforms to the ideas that you've set out and the ideals that you've set out, and therefore we've urge you to vote opposition.
I'd like to welcome the third proposition speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, abandoning nuclear power is both the safest, most economically and environmentally efficient thing that we can do. And I've identified 3 points of clash that I'm going to go over in my speech in order to sort of prove to you why the proposition we think will win this debate today. My first point of clash is going to be, does nuclear power cause unacceptable harm to humans? Secondly, is nuclear power important in protecting the environment? And thirdly, is abandoning nuclear power too expensive to actually bother with doing it? But my first point of clash, does nuclear power cause unacceptable harm to humans? Which obviously we would say yes. So in our speeches today, we've talked to you about plant safety and the safety of nuclear power plants, which we don't think is good enough. Because effectively, you've got a couple of problems with a nuclear power plant. You've got the dangers of explosion, which we've seen in cases such as Chernobyl and things like that. And we think you've also got the long-term dangers, which have been which have been mostly ignored by the opposition today. So they give us this analogy of the plane crash, which we don't actually think represents what we're talking about at all. Because a plane crash, the reason you continue getting in planes and you allow this risk to continue is because it doesn't have the long-term and massive global effects that you have with a nuclear power plant explosion, right? Because they're ignoring the long-term effects that come with the dangers of radioactivity that affect people, such as in Chernobyl, such as our first speaker talked to you about people in Ukraine and that kind of thing. That continue to be affected for years, right? So we don't think this analogy stands up, and we think this is the problem with the opposition's argument so far. You've also got the danger
Point of
of the
information.
of the unavoidability of risk within nuclear power plants. So they tell us that it's a very small chance, and we say that it still happens, even though nuclear power hasn't actually been viable for that long. So we think that the amount of times it's happened is unacceptable.
Point of
And we give you
information.
we'll give you some examples of harm in other situations, such as because we think that risk is always unavoidable in like big production situations, such as the factory collapse in Bangladesh and a chemical spill in India. We think that things like this will constantly happen.
Point of information.
I'll take you in a second. We think that things like this will constantly happen, and you can't avoid it in a nuclear power plant, but it's just that the effects are so much worse. Yeah.
Well, you've identified both Chernobyl and Fukushima, but you're using those two examples to justify nuclear energy being dangerous. If you can give us 3 more examples of high-profile accidents, we'll concede the debate.
We don't think you should need 5 examples of a high-profile accident where so many people are dying in order to cancel this. We think that the risks caused by these accidents that we've so far listed are big enough to actually to be a viable reason to get rid of it, right? We think that you can't avoid things like the other unavoidable thing is natural hazards, which is what caused Fukushima, right? You can't avoid things like that in terms of nuclear power. So you're always, no thank you, you're always going to have these risks, and we don't think that they're worth it. We secondly told you about waste and the risks involved with getting rid of nuclear waste, right? And so they tell you about these procedures and precautions that are in place to deal with it. We say that in the same case as you had the factory collapse and things like that, you're always going to cut corners in terms of business. And we think that, no thank you, we think that corners have been cut in the past in terms of nuclear waste, such with the cat litter example that my partner talked to you about. And we think that this just shows that mistakes will be made in terms of waste, and the risk is too big to do it. So we don't think that it's a superior alternative to everything else, because we think that the risks such as radioactive poisoning and spills and leaks from the waste is too dangerous to get involved in. Clash number 2. Is nuclear power important in terms of protecting the environment? We reiterate waste is no thank you, is not safe for anything living. They tell us global warming is more hazardous than nuclear power because nuclear power only has these sort of local effects. We say again they're ignoring the long-term effects that come from it, and they're also ignoring the global effects, no thank you, that come from it. So you have places in around the countries that are affected that will continue to be affected, no thank you, by the radioactivity for many years. Right, we say that they are wrong in saying that it's only local effects and that makes it safer. We say that actually no, it doesn't.
Point of information.
No, thank you. Secondly, renewable energy, right? We think that this has considerably less risk, and we've already told you on the proposition today why you'll have more focus upon renewable energy in terms of when you get rid of nuclear energy. No, thank you. We think that the procedure will become more efficient and cheaper. Why? Because you'll have more money able to go to it, because it won't be focused on nuclear power, right? You'll get the government and you'll get support behind it, because once you take away nuclear power, people stop having this weird belief that it's better, and thus will support renewable power more, and then there'll be more support behind that, which is only achieved under our model, and we think that everybody agrees that the renewable power would be better, right?
Point of information.
No, thank you. Also on renewable power, they say that it's not actually viable yet because, like, in places that they describe as isolated areas without sun and wind and that kind of thing. And we say if they're isolated areas, you're not going to want energy transferred to them anyway, because there's not enough people to do that. So we don't think that's a large problem in terms of renewable energy. We think that renewable energy will be good enough in the areas that we actually want to concentrate it in. Thirdly, is abandoning nuclear power too expensive? So firstly, we say it's a slow process, not a great strain on each country, because we'll give them a long time. It's not an immediate ban, it's not tomorrow, right? So we think that it won't be an immediate strain on each country economically, and also they'll have the IAEA to assist with cost and dismantling. Yes.
If you've got the amazing IAEA, why don't you use it to make every single process a lot safer rather than wasting billions of pounds trying to decommission every single nuclear power plant? Like, what's the viability in your motion? Why don't you go for a much more sensible sensible alternative that doesn't give in to fossil fuels and instead has like some sense behind it.
We don't think it's possible to do this because we've already seen these examples, and that we think that the examples, the risks will get more the longer you leave them. So the more we have nuclear power for like multiple years, the more risks and the more accidents will occur. If we get rid of them now, then we won't have as many risks. We say that we will be able to do that safely because it's all everybody's concentrating on doing that in a shorter space of time. We think that that's just what that's what will happen, because once you've got this process going, it will essentially be safer than just sort of watching them as they do more and more damage throughout the years. Secondly, every bit of money spent on nuclear power is a step away from renewable energy use. So we say that in terms of money, we think that it's a waste of money in the long term. When their plants eventually come around to our greener way of thinking and have to convert to renewable energy anyway, that will just be a waste of money in the future. We're just getting there earlier because we think it's safer and because we think it's better for the environment. Thirdly, we say that some cost which will occur, because we're not denying that, is okay, because we actually think that a better world that we're aiming for, a greener world and a safer world, is worth it, is worth this this amount of cost that will come from decommissioning the plants, right? We think that you should agree that that converting to renewable energy overall and getting rid of the risk that occurs from having these power plants will eventually be worth it. So what have I told you today? I've told you why nuclear power causes unacceptable harm to humans and why we don't think this should be the case anymore. I've told you why nuclear power is not important in protecting the environment. In fact, we should get rid of it. And I've also told you why abandoning nuclear power isn't too expensive, because we think it's the best thing in the long run. So for everything I've said, please vote proposition.
I'd like to thank the third proposition speaker, and now I'd like to take the third opposition speaker.
There are always going to be risks associated with nuclear power plants. Meltdowns are common. We admit meltdowns are rare. It's a large organisation with numerous members. We'll make a better future for mankind. We think these quotes, first of all, inherently are conflicting and contradictory. First of all, there's the obvious one. Meltdowns are common. We admit meltdowns are rare. And second of all, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the proposition side today has a huge misunderstanding of the word risk. Right? So, I'm going to talk to you today about the 3 points of clash that I've identified in this debate. Is the risk of nuclear power acceptable? Which side provides better priced energy? And who better protects the environment? So first of all, I'm going to talk about the risks with nuclear power. So first of all, I'd like to bring in this idea, which was danced around by Natasha, about there being an inherent danger around nuclear power. So we believe that because we've been working with nuclear power for so long, we understand that there is an inherent danger. We understand that there is a danger around this. And that's why we have safety protocols. We actually believe that the plane crash analogy that was used by my partner Sam very well, although it may not talk about the longer term effects of a meltdown, it does in fact talk about illustrate the risks associated with it very well. We're not going to ban the entirety of the aeroplane industry just because of that Germanwings crash earlier last month. We believe that there are huge benefits that I will outline, that have been outlined to you by both of my colleagues earlier on, that the proposition is completely ignoring, be it about economics or be it about the environment. So first of all, we believe that the proposition has hugely overblown the severity of a lot of nuclear accidents, and they've also hugely overblown the how often they occur. So first of all, we think that the examples that they've given to us today are Fukushima and Chernobyl. Both of these accidents were caused by accentuating circumstances that were oftentimes out of the control of the proprietors. So first of all, I'll take Chernobyl. Chernobyl was a Soviet power station, so it was run under Soviet Soviet safety protocols, which instead of making sure that the plant was safe, what they were actually trying to do was outcompete America at this time. So we believe that the meltdown of Chernobyl was most likely caused by wanting to outcompete the USA and try and build a bigger nuclear reactor and all this stuff. And first of all, and second of all, we believe that the Fukushima nuclear disaster was caused by completely accentuated circumstances. It was caused by an earthquake, ladies and gentlemen. As Natasha quite clearly pointed out, we can't do anything about these earthquakes, right? Except we can do things about these earthquakes, right? So what have we done? What have we done recently? What has the nuclear industry done about earthquakes and nuclear reactors? So since the Fukushima disaster in 2011, power stations on fault lines, all power stations on fault lines, including the rebuilding of the Fukushima nuclear power plant, and also power stations in the state of California which are on fault lines, now have seismometers on them that shut down the nuclear reactor when there is any evidence of an earthquake coming. So we believe, first of all, this is evidence that it shows that we're learning from our mistakes. And second of all, I'll take you in a minute, second of all, it shows the speed of the advancement. Because this disaster was only 4 years ago, we've already advanced so far that we're actually trying, we're going to completely cut these disasters out of the equation. Wouldn't you agree?
No, you admit that Chernobyl was caused by competing businesses. We think this is always going to occur, and this is why they'll cut corners and do things that will make it unsafe. Do you think that that's reasonable, and that cutting corners and allowing competing businesses in nuclear power to occur is worth the lives that it costs?
No, not at all. We believe that Chernobyl was caused not by competing businesses, but by competing nations. We think that is completely separate. I'm not going to go into all the semantics of the Cold War and how capitalism and communism is completely different between a fight between two businesses. Right? I'm not going to try and do that. We think it's a completely different argument. And second of all, I'd like to talk about waste, ladies and gentlemen. So we think also proposition has over-exemplified the problem of nuclear waste. We believe that the amount of waste per year has been over-exaggerated. It's only actually 105 metres cubed, which is about the volume of this classroom right here, right? So there's not actually that much of a problem when putting it away. It's also disposed of using glass and in the concrete containers underground, which my partner Sam mentioned, right? We know about this inherent danger, which I've touched upon earlier. We know about this inherent danger, and there's been problems with nuclear waste in the past. So we have learnt from our mistakes, and we have improved our methods of doing this. So, on to the second clash. So which side provides better priced energy? So we believe that the economics that have been cited by my partner Sam, right? First of all, the cost of building a nuclear power plant is £14 billion, around £14 billion. And the cost of dismantling one is £73 billion. This was said by my partner Hannah. And it's also rising. So that first of all, you're getting an immediate loss of about £60 billion right there, right at the start. And however long you're going to draw this out upon, however long you're going to draw this out by, it's still going to be an incredibly significant amount of money onto a country's economy. And this is going to have to happen in France, for example, hundreds of times over because of the amount of nuclear power stations there are there. So, and it's also much cheaper per megawatt hour. It's £5 cheaper per megawatt hour, and there's a lot of megawatt hours coming out of these power stations, than renewable energy. So it's cheaper to produce than renewable energy, and it's much greener than coal or fossil fuels. I'm going to touch upon why coal and fossil fuels come into this debate massively in a minute. So therefore, nuclear power gives a better balance between cost and energy produced. So on to the third clash. Who better protects the environment? We do. So we believe that, first of all, there's a reluctance in the modern market to move away from fossil fuels. We think this was said by my partner Sam. So it's evidenced by our ability right now. I believe that we have the ability as in this world, particularly in the United Kingdom, to move away from unrenewable energy sources such as coal and fossil fuels. But we're not. We're sticking with them because they produce a quick fix of energy, and that we don't necessarily want to be spending all this money in developing renewable sources of energy, because it's going to take a very long time. And in fact, that search for renewable energy may be completely fruitless. So, this would in fact lead to greater demand from fossil fuels. It's evidenced by when the UK's nuclear power percentage reduced, as said by my partner Hannah. Our percentage of power that was produced by coal increased, and therefore in turn greenhouse gases. So we believe there's a reluctance to move away from unrenewable energy. And second, we believe that the analysis by my partner Hannah beats the analysis that's been given all along the proposition table on renewable energy, over how she says that not everywhere is suited to hydroelectric power or wind farms or things like this. So we think that nuclear power, while it may not be completely renewable, will be renewable for thousands more years, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, there is the plutonium and uranium that comes out of these reactions, which can be recycled and reused again to produce more energy. And second of all, there is an abundant supply of uranium and plutonium still in our Earth. So nuclear, as far as applicable for humans, is still renewable. So ladies and gentlemen, for all the points that I've made, for all the points that my partners have both made, I urge you to vote opposition.
Can we now have the opposition reply speaker?
Ladies and gentlemen, today the government have sought to justify a fundamental shift in the way we get our energy on the basis of the fact that it supposedly causes environmental damage and the fact that it's damaging generally and it's dangerous. They've given us 2 examples, no more. They've given us Fukushima and Chernobyl. Ladies and gentlemen, there are 450 power stations at least around the world, and they've been running for thousands of days. We tell you on side opposition today that if they can only provide 2 examples in all of that time of areas when it's gone wrong, it sounds pretty safe to us. The second justification, that somehow the toxic waste that's produced is really dangerous. There are examples, none. They couldn't provide a single one. Ladies and gentlemen, renewable energy and nuclear energy are one and the same thing. They fit the definition perfectly. And we tell you today that they're entirely safe and they're a massively positive thing for mankind, and that the only area and sector that can outcompete fossil fuels. So for those reasons, we fundamentally support them. 2 areas of this debate today. Firstly, why is it needed now? And secondly, why will it be needed in the future? So ladies and gentlemen, why is nuclear power needed now? We think nuclear power provides cheap, carbon-free, renewable energy. We think to scrap it would be a massive waste and would damage the environment. Why would it damage the environment? Because it's the only sector that can outcompete fossil fuels, because it's the only sector that can actually produce energy. The only area of renewable energy that can actually produce anything is hydroelectric, and that suffers from a crippling lack of investment due to the fact that those resources aren't available. We tell you today that actually renewable energy in their definition would never be able to outcompete fossil fuels because of the lack of investment. What the nuclear sector does is it gives it a platform and it gives it a renewable, carbon-free way of doing things, which we think is ultimately a beneficial thing. We think the risks they tell us today are tiny in comparison to the benefits that they bring us. And the 2 examples that they bring us will probably not be repeated again, ladies and gentlemen, because in both of those 2 examples, extenuating circumstances happened. There isn't a Cold War anymore, so there isn't the Soviets and the Americans trying to outcompete each other with disregard to safety precautions, and there's probably not going to be like another earthquake that can cause a nuclear radiation, because we learned from it from last time. In every situation where there isn't bizarre extenuating circumstances that won't happen again, there has never been a nuclear disaster, according to government, so we think their point just doesn't stand and their entire risk analogy just doesn't make any sense. Secondly, why we need it in the future. Because, ladies and gentlemen, global warming exists, global warming is a threat, and we have to stand up to it and face up to it in the future. We're never going to do that just by relying on wind farms and hydroelectric power plants. We've got to face up to the fact and take things onto the nuclear level, because that's the only way we're ever going to make a change. Ladies and gentlemen, if we introduce hydroelectric power for everyone and wind power for everyone, the chances are there probably would be a mistake at some point. Perhaps a wind turbine would collapse and decapitate someone. We wouldn't seek to ban it because of one mistake that's been made. So it makes sense that we continue to use the most important and the most powerful source of energy in the future, regardless of the 2 bizarre examples that they keep repeating over and over again. Ladies and gentlemen, when you strip away those points, the government are left with nothing but assertion, and today the opposition have proved why, ladies and gentlemen, this would be better, not just for the environment, not just for supporting renewable sources, but also just because it's generally the best way of producing energy, and it'd be a massive waste and a massive historical mistake if we were to scrap this massive step forward in human progress. So for ladies and gentlemen, for all the points I and my partners have made today, we beg you to oppose the motion.
I'd like to thank the opposition reply speaker for his speech, and I'd like to welcome the proposition reply speaker.
Over and over again, for the previous reply speech, we heard that throughout this debate, we have only mentioned 2 examples. For that simple reason, we only mentioned 2 examples as these were the biggest. But now I will go over a few more, which we feel that support our case even more. 1986, we had Chernobyl, which we've already mentioned. We've also had Idaho Falls, had Pripyat in Ukraine, had Tokuno in Japan, we've had Miyakuna in Japan, and we've also had Fukushima. Now, I believe that actually exceeds the 5 limit that Sam said he would concede the debate over. However, I am going to continue for the sake of the debate as a whole. So I'm going to start off with my first kind of area of clash, which is this idea that can safeguards ever provide a future for nuclear power that is without dangers and its drawbacks. And yes, eventually over time, I fully admit that we've given an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of people even giving their lives to this sort of thing, we will eventually get there. However, is it okay to put those humans' lives in a position of further scientific progress? To that we say no, quite simply because we stand for compassion. We stand for the idea that a single life is worth more than possibly developing an area of science that already has competition to begin with. Additionally, moving on to some things that have gone wrong recently. So last year we had an incident in New Mexico where cat litter was used to clean up nuclear waste. Now I know that this is just one example, but however, if this continues, then there are going to be more and more incidents like this where the wrong people get in charge of nuclear power and can make mistakes like this. And always human error will occur. There is no way that you can phase out the simple ideology of a mistake from life. When people make mistakes, accidents occur, and accidents on a nuclear scale can harm people around them and people the world over. So, why do we think that this sort of development of nuclear power isn't worth these lives? Because quite simply, we see that renewable energy is an alternative, and the development of renewable energy will take money and time, where the development of nuclear power will take money, time, and people's lives, which is we see that we win that on a balance of harms. Now, my final point of clash is on what benefits do nuclear power bring? And I will fully admit that nuclear power brings a terrific amount of energy that could be used the world over. However, the more and more countries use nuclear power, the more and more nuclear power plants there are, the more quickly these nuclear supplies are going to run out. And then if the entire world has its entire energy supply based around nuclear power, which could happen if it's so bountiful in its energy sources, then when it goes away, it's going to hit the world like a truck. And there's going to be a period where people then realise the mistake they made without investing in renewable energy, and then you have an issue the world over that takes time, years and years and years, of humans living in the dark ages without electricity in the majority of the planet. And we don't want that to happen. So what we also see is that nuclear power does is it gives a massive risk to human life and animal life. And because we stand for life as a whole, because we stand for animals' rights and human rights, we say that we should not have nuclear power. So what have I told you today? I told you that firstly, we have many examples of incidents where nuclear accidents have killed people. Additionally, these incidents where nuclear power doesn't even kill people, it could lead to further disasters in the past, such as the cat litter incident in New Mexico. And additionally, for the fact that the things that nuclear power offers us in the short term, and only the short term because the more reliance on it, the quicker these resources are going to dwindle, I say that renewable energy is the path of the future and the path that you should all choose today. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the proposition reply speaker for his speech. Thanks for the debate, and can everyone please shake hands?